Okay, great. So let's get started real quick. So apologies, my webcam is being frustrating today, so I'm just going to be on voice hosting this webinar. So welcome to our weekly webinar hosted by Ideas, and today we have Ashwin here to tell us about building trust in the age of AI and data science. And this is hosted by Ideas, and just a little bit about Ideas is we're a nonprofit organization bridging the gap between academia and industry. And we help people connect between industry professionals, academia professionals, and also students to help foster those connections and build a nice data science hub to further the industry. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Ashwin, who has his slides up, and he can go with the self-introduction there. So thank you, Ashwin.
Thanks, Austin. So hopefully you guys can hear me and see me again. This is a combination of me speaking, obviously, but I think the presentation, which should be on your screen, is really where the focus needs to be. So thanks, Austin, for the introduction. So I've been in the tech industry, particularly in the data security, for about, I'd say, 20 plus years. And about a year and a half ago, I started getting really interested in ethics and trust when it comes to AI and machine learning and data science. And this was probably 6 months before the Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing happened. So it was interesting timing. In my current role, I'm actually a COO of a small cybersecurity platform for knowledge sharing and learning. So that's my day job. It is aligned with my passion, which is about AI, ethics, and technology, which you'll get to know in a bit. So today's topic is how to build trust in this age of AI and data science. And this is not a esoteric topic anymore. It is front and center, as we will see. And every business, regardless of where you are, is going to be impacted by this. But before we move forward, I just wanted to take a little bit of time and thank people for coming to this live today. I know it's the weekend, so you've obviously taken time from your family or significant others and other activities to be here. So thank you for that. And one other call out, I'm actually looking out right now. I was talking to Austin just before the webinar. I'm actually based in San Jose, California. And for a lot of you who are either in California or have heard about what's going on over here, we have 3 fires burning. One is the largest in California history, which is about 200 miles north. The reason I bring that up is because I just want to give a big shout out to our firefighters, the men and women who are bravely helping us stay safe, and our prayers and well wishes for those who've actually got impacted from this fire. So I just wanted to call that out because it's something that's clearly top of mind for me, at least. So let's get started. So for those of you who own an Alexa or a Google Home, have you ever thought about your neighbor stopping by and her conversation may be recorded by your Alexa? So just think about that, and as we move forward. So if you look at businesses today, there are 4 forces that I believe every business is dealing with today, and we'll get into all 4. Right at the top, at the 12 o'clock position is the big data, and we'll talk about what that means. Next, moving to your right, is regulation, ethics, and privacy. And all these 4 are some things that business have to contend with today. So let's start with each one. So big data. So big data and machine learning is obviously here, and a lot of you are clearly in that space, so I don't have to tell you about it. But let's take a little bit of context as to why this is happening and why now. Storage. A lot of it, and the name big data obviously itself implies that big means you need to have places to store. But why now? The first one is plummeting costs. For those of you who are iPhone users, do you ever think about how much you're paying for the cloud storage? It is ubiquitous, right? And it's ridiculously cheap. And same thing, whether it's Google Drive, whether it's Dropbox, Box, doesn't matter. But the cost of storage has become so cheap that we've stopped thinking about it, right? So that's number one. The second is ubiquitous access. Remember those days when you had cameras and you worried about whether you had a SSD of, I don't know, 32 gig or 64 gig, and what if you run out of storage? Those days are gone, right? Because why? Because the cloud is accessible everywhere. And I have an Android, so when I take a photo, I know it's automatically going to get backed up to Google Photos, right? So I don't think about it anymore. So just the ability to not just have local access, but extension cloud access. And the last one is a really interesting one, because I have heard this not once, not twice, I kid you not, probably about 100 times when I talk to people about why they are collecting so much data. And these could be entrepreneurs, it could be small companies, large companies, and they may not have any AI or any kind of models built today, but FOMO, or the fear of missing out, causes them to collect data like there's no tomorrow, right? And because of the first two things, which is cost and ubiquity, there is very little downside in their head about collecting data. But what if they don't collect data and they miss out on the opportunity to run these fancy algorithms and be able to come out with predictions? So that whole connection about the storage being the kind of the centerpiece of this revolution is very, very key, right? So that's number one. The second one, tied to storage, what's the next thing you need? What do you do with all this data? Compute. And it's the same thing. I mean, compute is becoming ridiculously cheap. Imagine getting to do what you do on your MacBook Air, which is my laptop of choice, and compared to the horsepower that this has versus even your big IBM mainframes of 20 years ago. And not just that, the cost. So, and this is not just on your, on you and I on our laptops, but there's also extensions into the cloud about your EC2 instance or your serverless computing or function as a service. And you have all of these different ways of computing that are, again, ridiculously cheap. So we talked about storage. The next thing is, again, compute, which is very, very cheap. Number two, and this might sound familiar, ubiquitous access. And this is important because it used to be that, hey, I need to collect all this data, I need to run it in the cloud for scale purposes and for accessibility purposes. Not anymore. And why? Because look at the third bullet. You can actually run compute at the point of data collection now. So everything about edge computing or fog computing. So now you have the ability with IoT in particular, where yes, you might have to stream some data back to the cloud, but you can also run compute. You can also run basic analytics at the point of collection. So, and this was unheard of even 5 to 8 years ago, right? So the combination of the ability to store ubiquitous access and plummeting costs, as well as the ability to compute on demand wherever you want at ridiculously low prices, is really the tipping point that allows us to be where we are right now. And finally, so we talked about storage, we talked about compute, software. Now, arguably, software has been there for a long time, right? But because of the first two things of now you have data sets, now you have plummeting costs when it comes to compute, but you also have the ability to build more models, and sophisticated algorithms are available today. And even for startups, right, there are models, pre-existing models that they can build. So you really don't have to go and start from scratch. And this is something that wasn't even available even arguably 2 to 3 years ago, right? So it's not just about saying, hey, I have to go and build all this myself. No, you don't, right? Much like open source, and we've seen the major acquisitions in the open source businesses. So clearly, large companies are taking notice, whether it's GitHub being picked up by Microsoft, whether it's Red Hat being picked up by IBM. So the point being that the pre-existing models gives a jump start to lots of companies who otherwise wouldn't be in the space. And the last one is also really, really important, is it's not just about having these models, it's about making them custom to your data. So the ability to retrain models, again, why? Because you have compute, which is cheap, and you also have data collection, which is unique to your environment, which allows you to retrain models. So this is just the first pillar where we talk about how big data is actually causing this tsunami to happen, right? So keep that in your head as we move to the next piece, which is switching gears. Now we're going to talk about privacy. And this is important because this is clearly not something that you hear every day. Now it's becoming commonplace because of a lot of the exposes that are happening, but it's still at a noise level when compared to big data or ML or data science, deep learning, etc. But it is finally starting to happen. So an example of this is the Center for Humane Technology. So Tristan Harris, if you look up his name, he used to be Google's chief data ethicist, and now he co-founded the Center for Humane Technology. And it's really an interesting one because what their definition is, they're realigning technology with humanity's best interests. So again, that choice of words is really interesting because it's technology to help humanity, right? And that is very, very different than what we've seen with whether it's bots, whether it's addictive nature of some of these applications, etc. The second is Omidyar, the Omidyar network. The name might be familiar to some of you. If not, he was the co-founder of eBay, one of the most successful IPOs. I think it was about 20 years ago now. So he started this thing called Omidyar network, and they're a venture firm, but the idea behind the network itself is to enable technology as a force for doing good. And their mission statement, and I read it, is to help technologists prevent, mitigate, and correct societal downsides in technology and maximize positive impact. So these are, again, very powerful people with strong networks and who've been incredibly successful in their technology domain, but now shifting gears very aggressively to ensure that humanity and technology are aligned and not pitting heads against each other. And then there are people, and these are people that I know. I'm sure there's a much bigger network out there. Patty Efta, David Ryan, Paul Gurn. And if you look at these people, you can see they're there with a mission. David, for instance, goes by the name of tech ethicist, right? So imagine even thinking about something like a technology and ethics even 2 years ago. And he's amazing in terms of just raising awareness of what this means. Patty, again, is an amazing person who brings forces together, whether it's regulators, whether it's technologists, whether it's big government, and allowing them to have a conversation so everyone's point of view is heard, and ultimately we can move forward in a manner that is understood, transparent, and people feel that they're heard. So these are just a few examples of what activism is happening when it comes to privacy. When it comes to software, again, there are examples of how privacy is being taken seriously. So Signal is a great example, and you can go take a look at it, but it allows secure communication. TunnelBear, now, again, none of these are companies that have any kind of business association with. I'm just bringing this up because I feel they solve a important issue. TunnelBear is a VPN client that I use all the time, but what it really does is allows the ability for the end user to take control. So again, my background, like I told you, is technology and security. So, but TunnelBear is so easy to use, but more importantly, by creating a tunnel from where you are, so let's say you're in Southern California, and you can actually choose where the VPN tunnel ends. So it could be in Canada, it could be in the UK, it could be in the US, and that's the IP address that is being seen by the website that you're going to. So just by using something as simple as a VPN tunnel, you are now obfuscating, or you are disallowing a website to track you based on your IP address, right? It's a simple thing, but again, the point being, it allows the end customer to, or the end consumer in this case, to take back their privacy. And the last one is something called Facebook News Eradicator. So try it. It's very interesting. I tried it for a while. I'm not a big Facebook user, so when I say tried it for a while, it's not like I got upset and went back to traditional Facebook. I hardly use Facebook. But the Facebook News Eradicator, what it does is it actually removes the noise, right? So all of these so-called algorithm pop-ups that come in, and things that the algorithm decides that you need to be looking at, it eradicates that, and the user experience is stunning. I mean, I literally would see nothing compared to when I was not using the news eradicator, right? So it's just something that gives you as a end consumer some control back. And I say some with hesitation because really we are pitting ourselves against supercomputers out there, right? Whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter, doesn't matter. But there are ways to actually use software in a fashion that is ultimately aligning the human interests. So moving forward, exposés. So the first one is obviously something that everybody should be reasonably familiar with, which is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica. And the second one is Alexa, right? I mean, Alexa has obviously been in the news, whether it's recording a conversation between a husband and a wife that actually got sent to their best friend, and Alexa says mea culpa, or Amazon says mea culpa. So these things are constantly happening, but what this is doing is raising awareness among the consumer that this is not just your average speakerphone. This is not just your typical dumb radio. This is a thinking, living being in your home that is listening to you, right? I mean, that awareness is what these kinds of exposés are bringing in. And then I have my own personal one that I'll show you. So we are an AT&T Uverse household. And I was in Canada, I think it was back in May or June when the World Cup football or soccer, depending on which part of the world you come from, was going on. And I think this was the match between Russia and United Kingdom. And the point was it was Croatia and UK. So I'm not sure who was playing who, but I was definitely sure it was either semifinal. I think it was the semifinals. But the point was, I was remote. I'm based in San Jose, California. I was in Canada, Vancouver, and I wanted to see the match. And AT&T Uverse has this app which allows you to stream content if you're a Uverse subscriber. So on the left, I actually downloaded the app for the first time so that I could see the match. And when I downloaded the app, the first thing it showed me was what you see on the left, which is AT&T Uverse needs access to my identity, my location, my photos, media files, Wi-Fi connection, and device ID, and call information. Now, typically, I'd argue 99.9% of users would hit accept and move on. But I'm in this exception, if you will, where I had no reason to allow AT&T, for instance, to look at my call information. It had no reason to. All I wanted to do was stream and watch the match. So I hit accept because there's no way to move forward. There's no decline over here, unless I didn't want to watch the match. So I hit accept, and the next thing I did was go to my settings and did what you can see on the right, which is revoke all the permissions. So even before I used the app, I installed the app, I went to the settings, and then removed access to contacts, location, phone, and storage. And lo and behold, what did you think happened? Did you think the app crapped out and said, oh, you can't watch the match? No, it just worked. I was able to watch the entire match between meetings. So the point is, and this goes back to software, right? The default setting, if I'm a software developer and I have a developer's toolkit which says, hey, default is ask for everything. Whether or not I need it is immaterial. Default is ask for everything, and 99.9% of the users will either because they're unaware or because they're in a hurry will hit accept. And now you're instrumenting that user ad infinitum, right? So just something to be aware of. And from an awareness perspective, some of you may have seen, again, news-making biases that were, I think, about maybe 6-9 months ago. So in the case of Microsoft, there was a racial tweet by its AI chatbot. And give credit where credit's due, Microsoft immediately acknowledged that and pulled that chatbot back. Google had tagged 2 African Americans as gorillas through facial recognition software. Again, this is something I believe it happened a year ago. But the point is, Why did this happen? Because in Google's case, they didn't have enough data sets of that demographic, right? So they could go and extend that to make that happen. But what it also exposed, which is very interesting, is AI is now exposing the inherent biases that you and I have. And this is something that people had not expected, right? You're codifying human brains, whether it is data sets or what data sets and where do you go collect the data, whether it is algorithms that are being mimicked based on human biases, the software program itself. So it's a really interesting side effect of exposing biases in you and me, and by extension, companies who are forward thinking and who don't start defending it, but rather embrace it and go and correct it, is a huge positive outcome. There's a interesting book, and I just started reading it, so I haven't read it completely, but it's called Radical Markets by Whale and Posner. And the premise there is it talks about a revolution where data is treated as labor. And again, let me repeat that. Data is treated as labor. Why? Because all day long, you and I and everybody else under the sun is providing data, whether it's to Facebook, whether it's Google, whether it's your local service provider, doesn't matter. And by associating data to labor, now what Whale and Posner are proposing is a market where you and I will become much more active because we are providing the labor, aka data, and therefore we can start participating in that market of associating how much our data is of value, right? So again, it's brand new, and again, this is not the only one. Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, go look him up. He has a open source project called Solid, and now there's a commercial venture called Interrupt, INRPT, I believe it's called, and which is very, very similar in nature about how we are not only data creators, but also data custodians, right? So we own our own data and we figure out who we give that data to and why and how much it's worth. And then there are conferences like the Wisdom 2.0 conference, which again, focus a lot on humanity and tech and ethics and how the confluence of that. So the awareness is definitely rising. Is it enough? Far from it, but at least there is a really, really strong start. And then let's talk about businesses, right? And this is probably the laggard over here. So we could talk about awareness, we could talk about what's happening in the consumer world and exposés, but finally, are businesses taking notice of where we are and where we're headed? So the answer is it's complicated, but it's starting to happen. So data transfer project, you can look it up. Again, it's a project. I think the current participants are Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Twitter. I believe those are the big four. And it's really an open source platform promoting universal data portability. Let me give you another example. And again, I'm bringing this up because this is not idle pontification, right? I mean, I'm trying to apply as much as I'm talking about it to myself. So GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, is a big sweeping mandate that went into effect May of this year. It is, the origins are EU or the European Union, but it has tentacles that touches businesses who transact with the EU either as a customer or they have partners there, etc. So it has legs beyond just the EU. Now, the reason I bring up GDPR is because it has a clause called allowing data portability. And LinkedIn, the professional social media platform, became compliant with GDPR back in May of this year, literally days after it went into effect. And I wanted to exercise data portability. So I went to LinkedIn's website, and lo and behold, they had a mechanism in place for every LinkedIn user where you could actually go and say, I want to port my data over, right? And I was amazed that within half hour, I got about 50% of all I'd ever posted, shares, etc. from LinkedIn. Within 24 hours, I got the rest. So literally within a day of actually making the request, in a CSV or a comma separated value file, which is something which is portable, I actually got everything I'd ever done on LinkedIn. And it was mind-boggling. And granted, I'm reasonably active on LinkedIn, but seeing everything in one fell swoop, the digital exhaust, as I call it, was stunning. But the point also is there are laws and there are ways to exercise one's rights, but people need to get more proactive about it, right? So data transfer project is, again, another example where companies could come together and allow for data portability, but unless people start exercising that, it's just another thing in the toolkit, but no one really does anything about it, right? The second one is boundless mind. The boundless mind is really interesting, is because their theory is that the tools that are there today, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Google, etc., they are built on the theory of persuasion, right? So the longer you stay on YouTube, the happier Google is. So therefore, they want this recommended list of videos on the right. And according to a study, 70% of all YouTube users look at the recommended list, right? So there's persuasion so that you stay on the platform. But what Boundless Mind does is it doesn't fight that. It doesn't come in and say, you know what, hey, we should stop all innovation and persuasion is bad. They say, okay, let's assume that persuasion is going to happen, but what if we provide a platform where the persuasion is for good? And for instance, they are selling to nonprofits and companies projecting companies that are in the business of promoting education, health, social welfare, right? So it's a very interesting twist on saying, okay, we're not going to fight this, but let's make sure that we apply the best minds so that we provide a platform where the so-called non-tech companies, but who are doing a lot of social good and now have the same level playing field in order to use that. So that's Boundless Mind. And Apple Digital Health, lots of Apple users probably know this already. It actually promotes the use of when iPhone users need to use their phones less, right? So, and even though the feature came out recently, the point was there's a lot of research that went into a company that pretty much rules the smartphone market coming and saying, hey, we need to make our users use our phones less. Now, you can look at it with cynicism and skepticism and saying, hey, this is Apple yet again. But it's still a good step forward saying, hey, a large consumer company that's one of the most iconic brands out there coming out and saying, hey, digital health is important, right? So it's a good step forward. And from a technology perspective, right, ethics is also here. And this is not lagging behind. The first one is something called user managed access. And again, you can look these up. These are all tying back to the original theme of saying, hey, where does the end user fit into this? And how can you and me have control over our data? The next one is an IEEE standard, which is called the Personal Data AI Agent. Now, this is an interesting one because it has been referred to in different shapes or forms. It's called AI Sidekick. In this case, it's called AI Agent. But the theory behind it is very similar, which is, yes, there are these supercomputers and amazing ML algorithms that are working, that can predict where I'm going to go next after this webinar ends. And there's nobody that's working in our favor, right? And this human mind can't be expected to fight all of these amazing machine learning and AI tools out there. So what if we had an AI agent? What if we had our own person or entity, which is also built on AI, which is looking out for us, right? It's a very interesting concept, but it's starting to get roots about something, an agent, which is also AI driven, aka it understands my biases, my perceived movement after 6 p.m. Pacific, after I leave here, where am I going? What should I be doing? How long should I be watching YouTube? And what's good for me, what's not? So something that's working on our behalf, right? Again, it's an interesting concept, and it's starting to get some attention in the tech industry. And the last one is AI explainability, right? And this comes back to the point of once human decisions are being now made, are turned into AI models, when something bad happens, so let's take the Microsoft example of when that racial tweet happened by the chatbot, going back and understanding why that AI model did what it did is what AI explainability is. So technology is also getting there to the point. It's you can't bring an AI tool or a model and expect it to explain what it did, right? But at the same time, humans have to understand that there will be cases, and we're going to be increasing number of cases where whether it's related to B2C, whether it's related to B2B, doesn't matter. But the need to know why an algorithm did what it did, why it predicted something a certain way, and being able to almost reverse engineer what happened behind that. So there's going to be a lot more of these AI explainability technology that's going to be important in every industry. I just talked about GDPR, right? So I won't spend too much time over here, but the point being, it's the first reasonably clear and well-cut regulation out there that makes it easy to understand, but it's a consumer, but it also makes it very clear in terms of the fines for non-compliance, and also the definition of data handlers. So there's something called data controller, there's something called data processor. So, and what GDPR has done is, for the first time, it's actually elevated the conversation. So I've had very, very small companies that I've talked to, and they are talking about GDPR. So they've actually delayed their rollout until they're GDPR compliant. Now, some people might say this is a heavy hand, but I sincerely believe that the ability to port your data, the ability to erase your data is going to be increasingly important, and having something as concrete as GDPR actually makes for a really good awareness among individuals and businesses. So the other ones from a regulations perspective, CACPA and being in California is a clearly important one, is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And it has a lot of connections back with GDPR. For example, you can opt out, you can delete, but it also has a little bit more teeth than GDPR itself. So California is obviously pushing the envelope when it comes to consumer privacy. So this is a step forward in that. The other two ones are really interesting, and I didn't even know of this until a couple of days ago. There was actually a Senate bill that was passed called Bill 237, which regulates IoT. Yes, Internet of Things. And what it does is sounds esoteric, but it's one of the most weakest links in IoT, which is default password. So what this one does is actually it forces manufacturers to have a unique password for each one of their IoT devices. And before the first time I, as a consumer, can use an IoT device, I need to go change it. So it sounds very small, but what it does is it forces the non-use of the default password. And usually today what ends up happening, there's a default password. That's the default password for all IoT devices. And if you go Google default password IoT devices vulnerability, you will see an enormous number of standard passwords, whether it's 123 or password 123, that is on these IoT devices. So this bill actually prevents that from happening, which is really good. The last one is Asilomar AI principles. So these are 23 principles that this group has put together, and there's some really, really big names behind this, including Elon Musk and others. But it is very, very interesting to see that, again, the California Assembly's support for these principles. Now, again, these are not enforceable per se, but seeing that the government is now connecting with a group of extremely well-renowned philosophers and scientists, so Stephen Hawking is on this list as well, and immediately raises the conversation about what are these AI principles look like. So I encourage you to go take a look at that as well. And from awareness perspective, the first thing is need for plain speak regulations. And we talked about GDPR, we talked about Consumer Privacy Act, go take a look at the IoT security piece I talked about. These are happening as we speak. So increasingly, it's no longer this thick, indecipherable language that is written by a lawyer that only a lawyer can understand. It's becoming much, much more plain speak, which is great. Consumer awareness, it is on the rise, but we have a long way to go. And I gave you a few examples of consumer activism, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's the IoT security, where you change your password, whether it's the Alexa, and people actually turning off Alexa because once they realize that it's listening to you. And these are all things that it's not about good or bad, it's awareness. So if as an Alexa consumer, you're okay with the fact you're giving up data in exchange for something, that's great. But that's the awareness piece, right? And which is the last piece, which is you're not mindlessly ticking the box because you want to go somewhere. So every time you tick a box, you're actually giving permission. And I think that awareness is super important. So businesses really have to wake up, right? And I will go through all four of these: data weaponization, data sharing, user control, transparency. So from a data weaponization perspective, there are four things a business needs to think of, right? Number one, how much data do I collect? Number one. Number two is, what insights and predictions AI do I derive? Three, how am I taking advantage of this asymmetrical relationship? And fourth, can I shred the weaponized data on demand? Now, the first one is going back to, remember the storage slide, which talked about plummeting costs, ubiquitous access. You can collect all the data that you want because it's cheap, but you need to know how much data you're collecting. Number two is an interesting one, is as you start running models, you will be able to predict things. And for instance, I think this was probably 2 years ago, Twitter was able to look at tweets and predict that somebody was going to go into a depressive state of mind in the next 30 to 60 days. An example. But now, as a business, you know more about your user, and you're predicting something which is obviously a strong prediction. What do you do with that, right? So you have to think about these things that you never had to think about prior to AI. Three, there's an asymmetrical relationship, again, same example, where I know something about my user that the user does not. Am I taking advantage of that? And the fourth one is, going back to the first, can you shred this data on demand? And it's important because while you might be able to shred the data, what about the learnings? Is that something that's under the purview, or do you still own that, right? So user control. Do you allow the user to stop sharing their data? And again, this is not 3 clicks away in some obscure web form that you're asking for 20 things before they can stop sharing their data. This is right at the top. You can opt out anytime you want. Now that's trust. Can I, as a user, choose how much data to share? Again, easy, top 3. Hey, share everything. Don't share location, don't share IP addresses, don't share physical attributes of my device itself. So again, there are different classes. Is the user aware of that? Third one is an important one, which is, what if I don't share my data? Am I getting penalized for that? Are you going to make my life miserable by having these pop-ups show up all the time? Are you going to purposely not give me incentives that you're giving to other users? Now, from a business perspective, if you're transparent with the user saying, hey, if you give me this, I'm going to give you that, that's one thing. But if you are not transparent with the user, but you grudgingly give them the ability to not share the data, but you treat them like dirt, now that's not acceptable. And then the last piece, which is going back to the Radical Markets book I talked about earlier, is, are you providing incentives for them to share the data? And again, this is a brand new concept where you are the data custodian and you figure out what business model works best for you. Data sharing. The first one is super important, and this is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica piece, which is, I might be aware when I'm using Facebook, which I don't, by the way, not very often, but if at least I know there's a transaction going on over there, right? But I have no idea who Cambridge Analytica is. So now, when Facebook takes the fact that I'm in San Jose, California, I'm high tech, I'm in cybersecurity learning and sharing, now that data is now being used by this third-party firm to target me. So am I aware of what's happening in the back end? Number one. Number two is, if you're sharing it with a third party, do I know what their privacy practices are? And again, the whole Facebook CA thing was exactly the same thing, which is they had a different set of privacy practices. And I, as an end user, have no idea. The third one, this is back to my LinkedIn example, is can I audit and revoke on demand? Which means, do I have the ability to do it? And again, this has to be top of mind. So it's not something that's buried somewhere and you hope as a business the user never does that. And is there a data sharing policy that is codified? Right? This comes back to, okay, we collect data from you for these reasons, and these are the people that we typically share data with. And a lot of this is lawyer speak today, which is completely unintelligible. So making it much more transparent, again, is a big way to build trust. Transparency. First one, terms and conditions. When was the last time you looked at the iTunes TNC, or any TNC for that matter, right? Average consumer has no idea what's going on. All you have to do is hit tick and move on. Second, and this is a hard one, is the customer aware of what data I'm collecting and why? Let me give you an example of this. Right? And again, I have nothing to do with Slack, except I'm a huge Slack user and a big Slack fan. And I'll give you one feature that reminds me on an ongoing basis that Slack is collecting data of me, but they're providing such value to me that I'm okay for them to collect the data. And the feature is something very simple. All it says is, if I haven't been on a Slack channel, I haven't been active on a Slack channel, let's say for a week or 2 weeks, it gives me a message saying, hey, Ashwin, you've been on the social channel, you've subscribed to the social channel, but you've neither contributed nor have you read anything from it for the last 2 weeks. Should I unsubscribe you from that channel? It's a small feature, but really powerful, because it's telling me right up front that Slack is letting me take noise away from my life. And how is it doing that? Because I know it's monitoring where I'm active and where I'm not, but it's also providing immediate value to me by saying, hey, let me disassociate you from this channel. So you have fewer channels and you can be much more prescriptive about what you do in those channels, right? So it's a small thing, but again, it reminds me constantly data is being collected, but I can also see the value I'm getting out of it. Third one, do I give the user an option to opt out? And again, we've talked about this before, but the idea being, hey, you constantly allow the user to opt out, and by making it constant and in their face, you're actually building trust. And the last piece is the radical markets piece we talked about earlier, which is it time we start getting paid for the data that we give, whether it's data as labor, whether it's the radical markets concept, whether it's Tim Berners-Lee with Solid and Interrupt. These are all initiatives or thought processes, awakening that's starting to happen right now. And what about you and me? It doesn't stop, right? And we've given a few examples where consumers need to take control, whether it's what apps you're using, what permissions you're giving them, awareness. We gave a lot of examples of that. How does user take control? Whether it's the LinkedIn data portability, whether it's my AT&T Uverse experience of turning off controls that absolutely they don't need. And then devices. What devices do you have in the house? And yes, IoT is obviously a big piece of it, but having control of what the devices do and why is super important. And you may think this is not happening in your business, but let me give you an example, right? If you phone screen candidates, and a lot of you, I'm sure, are either getting phone screened or do phone screens yourself, if you knew that you were being phone screened by an AI bot, would you feel outraged? Would you feel violated? If you're a manager, if you're outsourcing the phone screen to an AI bot, do you have to let your prospective future employees, aka the interviewee, know that ahead of time or not? Online dating site, and this is happening now, using AI chatbots to engage with customers. Yeah, I mean, you can pretend that you're a human on the other side, so you can engage more, but is it the right thing to do? So the point being that the potential is endless, and ethics will ultimately underpin what will separate the leaders from the rest. And I just leave you with one example on the bot itself. And again, this blew my mind. I thought I was up to date with the California laws, but apparently not. there's a California Bot Act of 2018. So go look it up. I'll just leave you with this one sentence which says, the use of a bot would not violate the act so long as the bot clearly alerts California users to the fact that it is not a person. So if I'm a bot and I'm engaging with you, I need to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm a bot. And then I'm okay. But if I don't, I'm in violation. So, and this is amazing because this is exactly what transparency and trust really means. But now you have regulations that are kicking in to alert businesses that it's no longer okay, it's no longer kosher to use these entities without the end user being aware. So those are my coordinates. Feel free to reach out to me. And Austin, I think I'm open to questions if there is still time.
Okay, yeah, cool. If anyone has any questions, you can leave them in the chat. And then if there's no questions, then we can end the webinar. Just we'll give it a few minutes for questions.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you for your talk. That was super cool, talking about a lot of relatable things to a lot of people with data.
Happy to do so. Thanks, Austin, and thanks to everybody for taking time off from their weekend to show up here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you too.